against or by any person based on grounds of religion or belief. Europe will always protect the right for everyone to have or not have a religion or belief. We condemn attacks against places of worship, persecution, discrimination against people of all faiths. We strongly condemn hatred, discrimination, violence, attacks perpetrated in the name of religion, including when directed against another religious group, against another ethnic or racial minority, against women, or against LGBTIQ persons. The Commission will remain steadfast in our commitment to protecting members of all religions from intimidation, discrimination, violence, attacks, and persecution. In particular, anti-Semitism has exploded in Europe, especially following the terrorist Hamas attacks 1 year ago on 7th of October and the war that has ensued. We are now facing the highest levels of anti-Semitism since the founding of the Union. Just in July, our Fundamental Rights Agency survey on anti-Semitic experiences showed that 96% of Jews in Europe encounter anti-Semitism either online or offline. In Europe today, as tragic as it may sound, Jews have started to hide again. This is unacceptable. This cannot be. We also see a rise in anti-Muslim hatred in Europe. Anti-Muslim hatred is reaching concerning levels in all our member states, also both online and offline. And it is particularly concerning to see anti-Muslim hatred increasingly present in the media and in the public political debates. To respond to this spiral of hate that followed the terrorist attack by Hamas on 7th of October, we adopted last December a joint communication entitled "No Place for Hate, a Europe United Against Hatred." This was an attempt to step up our efforts to fight hatred in all its forms and reinforcing actions and policy initiatives across the policy board. We are committed to ensure the protection of the right of all people to peacefully practice their faith in Europe. This is a right, probably the most European right of all, protected under Article 10 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. The legitimate expression of religions and beliefs must be protected. And this should aim in parallel at promoting peace, coexistence, dialogue, and understanding, not polarization, not toxicity. This is precisely at the heart of the regular dialogue with both religious and non-confessional organizations that I had the honor to coordinate the last 5 years, as per Article 17 of the treaty. We thought that this is the best way to engage our religious leaders, not only on discussing about religion, but also on harvesting their views on the big issues that we face as societies, and how many of these issues we had to deal with this in these last 5 years, from pandemic to war, instrumentalization, hybrid threats, so on and so forth. We also need to ensure that our member states transpose and correctly apply community law on criminalization of racist and xenophobic hate speech and hate crime. We have a framework directive of 2008 on combating racism and xenophobia that prohibits public incitement to violence or hatred, including, of course, on grounds of religion. We have so far launched 14 infringement proceedings against our member state during this mandate only, and we will make sure that these proceedings have come to results, because we're now detecting that member states have taken corrective measures and have adopted their legislation accordingly. But we also, as politicians, as European regulators, need to take urgent steps now to ensure that social media platforms play the game with us. Media platforms should have a role, a decisive role, to curb illegal hate speech, because they know what this is about when they host it. Since 2016, we have, of course, this voluntary code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online, and this has compelled all major media platforms to collaborate. Under this code, the participating companies have committed to assess and remove illegal hate speech content, and we will not let them without monitoring and assessing their compliance. Of course, now we have a regulatory superweapon in our hands, which is the Digital Services Act. These new rules on digital governance that allow us to anticipate, prevent, and deal with hate and waves of hate speech before they go viral. This is important because we are leading the way, we're leading by example worldwide in this front. In addition, you will remember that back in 2021, we have presented the first ever EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life in Europe. As a result of this initiative, all our member states, most of our member states now have national action plans against anti-Semitism, either completed or in the way of completion. 21 of them have appointed a national coordinator against anti-Semitism, and we are taking substantial measures to protect synagogues and Jewish schools with additional funding. Dear members of Parliament, the instrumentalization of religion must be rejected in Europe. Religious leaders around the world are standing with us against such instrumentalization. And I want to publicly salute the role of both Christian, Muslim, and Jewish leaders to that respect. Intercultural and interreligious dialogue must be promoted in Europe. Europe has nothing to fear from this dialogue. We are a project of peace and peaceful coexistence, and religious tolerance is at the heart. It's in our DNA. Our religious and non-religious, non-confessional organizations must also continue talking to each other, ensuring respect, freedom of expression, and taking stance on the big issues that worry us, issues of human rights, democracy, rule of law, and fundamental freedom. There you have it, honorable members. I think our objective as Europeans should be clear. Europe will never be a place for intolerance, intimidation, discrimination, persecution, attack in the name of religion or belief. We are the only continent in the world that we saw what happens when the forces of evil take over. We saw it twice in the last century, and we are determined never to see it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President Schinas. And now we start with the first round of speakers on behalf of the groups, starting with Mr. Zarzalejos, 2 minutes from EPP. The floor is yours.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, President. Vice President Schinas. I want to set out an idea that I think is important. Religious diversity isn't a religious issue, it's a question of freedom. And religious freedom, just like that of conscience or thought, are human rights, are inalienable human rights. Different religious denominations are part of our social fabric and have a place in public space. They're part of a democratic society, and people should be interlocutors in public conversation. Of course, there are clear limits. No religion can promote or justify violence or can ask for the right to create separate communities where civil laws don't apply. They are the same for all. We're having this debate in face of a huge rise in anti-Semitism, as Vice President Schinas explained. According to the European fundamental rights agencies, 80% of Jews in Europe hide their identity. We're also seeing acts of repression, as Mr. Schinas set out, and discrimination against Muslims. The Observatory on Intolerance against Christians has said that in 2023, over 700 hate crimes took place against Christians in 30 European countries. Ridicule, systematic offence, bullying, offence of all different levels are unacceptable behaviour, and we have to fight these and hate speech. In medieval Spain, we used to talk about al-Hama to refer to Muslim communities. In Europe, we don't want to see churches vandalised or any other acts of violence. We want to see is a Europe where minorities are protected. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Ms. Mendes on behalf of the S&D Group. 1 minute. The floor is yours.
Muito obrigada, Senhora Presidente. Senhora Presidente, caros.
Thank you very much, Madam President, colleagues, Commissioner. The Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU recognises the freedom of thought, religion and conscience. That's why we condemn all religious extremism. We also condemn anti-Semitic speech and anti-Muslim speech. This is discourse that is on the rise in our societies. This discourse leads to the instrumentalisation that we are now observing with discourse directed against immigration. That's why, Commissioner, I am saluting your campaign. Freedom of religion and of worship must absolutely be defended here in Europe, and we must also base ourselves on dialogue between the religions, which should facilitate integration, making Europe a haven of peace and integration, religious freedom, tolerance and respect, those being the values that the European Union is built on.
Ms. Ehlers, on behalf of the Patriots, 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Goedemorgen, dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you very much. The Netherlands has been long known as one of the most tolerant countries in the world. However, we've seen that anti-Semitism increasing in our country over the last few years. When we talk about growing religious intolerance in Europe, we have to call things by their true name. Intolerance doesn't come from Christians or Jews or Hindus. There are no pictures from France, Germany or the Netherlands of chasing infidels down the street with knives. The problem is really focused around one specific religion. Supporters of radical Islam target non-Muslims, Christians, women, homosexuals, and particularly Jewish people. Anti-Jewish statements are becoming a day-to-day routine. There are parts of our cities where gay couples dare not walk down the street hand in hand. Women are harassed in their own neighbourhoods, and the problem is growing day by day, particularly because there's an influx of radical Islamic immigrants who don't integrate into our countries. Does the Commission agree when refugees and other migrants engage in anti-Semitic speech or violence, shouldn't they be sent out of the country or perhaps denied nationality? I think there can be no place here for hate preachers.
Mr. Pelletier, on behalf of the ECR Group, 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Devant nous, une nef calcinée, des statues noircies.
Blackened statues, a burnt nave, and then the skies with the roof broken in, showing that. That's the church in Saint-Omer that was burnt down on the 2nd of September. The arsonist was a recidivist who'd already burnt down 4 churches in the Pas-de-Calais region, and this was another. Amongst the ashes, there were innumerable memories and silent prayers. Those who hate France's 1,000-year-old history, people acting without any reaction from the public authorities or a word from your commission. 39 churches have been burnt down in France since 2023. All intolerance and all hatred are being repressed, with just one exception, which is allowed to fester with the complicit gaze of parts of the left, and that is anti-Christianity. At the ceremony opening the Olympic Games, this was funded by the public authorities, and we seen cemeteries desecrated and profaned. You are afraid to counter the thinking of those of the 1968 generation. We, the children of the Franks, Clovis and Saint Clotilde, will fight relentlessly those who are burning down our hope.
Very much. The next speaker is Ms. Al-Zahlani, 1 minute and 30 seconds on behalf of the Renew Group.
Tack fru talman, herr kommissionär. Tack så mycket för dina ord.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, religious intolerance is on the rise, both in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Last year, I spoke here about the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. These are two phenomena that are a large part of the social concord, but which make life difficult for so many people. We thought that we'd successfully fought against anti-Semitism and learnt the lessons of the Second World War. Islamophobia doesn't tally with a functioning democracy. We have a lot of tools in our toolbox to fight this. DSA, DMA, other tools in the digital world. But what about in politics? We have people in this parliament who openly promote this sort of intolerance and promote this sort of hate and use the parliament as a platform to get their message across. And we have to combat that behaviour everywhere. The EU is a union of democracy, and that applies to everybody regardless, the same rights, the same values, regardless of their religion. We can't use religion to justify hatred against women. In Europe, we have a democracy. That's what governs our society. We don't want to go back to the Middle Ages in a society run by racists. Nobody should be under this sort of pressure. We're all equal and free.
Of the Greens for 2 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. A person's freedom to practice their religion is a right. It's a fundamental human right, and it's set out in international law. It's written into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I hope, at least, that we can all agree to that principle. Yes, but even here, I regularly hear certain political groups oppose some people's rights to others. Some groups have fewer rights than us. I'm talking about the far right here. They attack freedom of religion when it works for them and when it comforts their supporters. This is not acceptable. No religion is superior to another. No religion is homogenous. No religion should be stigmatized. No religion should be used as a pretext for stigmatization. What do the far right do here in this hemicycle? They try to play off people's rights against each other. They talk about the Great Replacement theory. They support anti-Muslims for the Sakharov Prize. This is all incitement to hatred. The rise in religious intolerance has to be fought at source. We have to talk about it, but we have to act as well. Act here in the heart of the European Parliament. We will never stop saying this. Racism and religious discrimination are crimes. They're not opinions. And anyone who aligns with the ideology of the extreme right is also guilty of propagating religious intolerance. Europe is attached to universal rights, so we need to have this debate. But we have to apply it to ourselves here and to start fighting hate speech and calls for discrimination. We can't play religions off against one another. That's already hate speech. And so I say here in this hemicycle, nobody has the right to do that.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Hassan, 1 minute and 30 seconds on behalf of the Left Group.
Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Commissaire.
President, Commissioner, members. After the knife attack in Southport, we saw an eruption of violence based on rumours about who was the attacker, who was falsely identified as a Muslim. So it's not just the violence of the riots, but the speed that they spread that should show the latent racism in our societies, and which that racism is focused on Muslims and Jews. In France, Islamophobic attacks have risen by 67% by 2020 to 2023, and in Germany, 3 attacks are carried out every day. So that shows the rise. Now, this is basically because of the racist words of the extreme right, like the Great Replacement theory, and that's even become normalized in public debate with the complicity of some of the media. We're seeing an institutionalization of Islamophobia, which can be found in discriminatory policies. This racism is basically a leftover of European colonialism, which is still a stain on the opinions of many of our fellow citizens. After the 7th of October, Islamophobic posts multiplied by a number of 43 on YouTube alone. In the same way, we shouldn't blame Jews in Europe for what the Israeli government is doing, but we should also highlight Islamophobia against Muslims in Europe. All forms of racism, including Islamophobia, should be combated with determination. As James Baldwin said, Islamophobia is not the business of one community, but the business of society as a whole. Thank you.
And then I will give the floor to Ms. Bovendig for 1 minute on behalf of the ESN, please.
Hungary, for 1,000 years, has been a bastion protecting Christianity, and in my country, the freedom of religion was enshrined first in the 16th century. So we are exemplary even today. No one is discriminated against because of his or her religion, which is not the case for most EU member states. There's a massive influx of foreign cultures in Europe, and there's an outrageous increase of hate crimes. But not only radical Islam is threatening us, but also the fanatic followers of liberal ideologies who are attacking the values and traditions which made Europe great. They want tolerance for themselves, while they are totally intolerant against Christian symbols. In France, churches are ablaze. In Germany, the columns of saints are beheaded. This is modernity. Modern freedom, ideas of enlightenment are also rooted in Christianity. If the EU doesn't protect its traditions, it's burying its own grave.
And now I will open up for the blue card option, if you want to do that. And the next speaker is Mr. Hutink, 1 minute and 30 seconds. Please.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. Hello, Commissioner. First of all, Commissioner, I want to thank you for your work in the past years on this important topic. Dialogue is the key to understanding. At the same time, one of the headlines of the past 5 years was to protect this European way of life, to protect, to identify, understand in broad terms who we are, what we are actually protecting, because it's this naivety, maybe, in this big, complex and contradictory world that sometimes if we forget who we are, we have more trouble to protect what we have. What we need to do is to become less tolerant with intolerance for our values. Rule of law, democracy, separation of state and church, equality between men and women, things that are not even said anymore or repeated, but they form the foundations of who we are. If we look at hate speech, hate crimes, and the increase of religious intolerance, also against any minority, whether it is Jews, Christians, or Muslims, I think what we first of all must do is continue this work, intensify it, and do not forget that the European way of life will be for all of us the last thing we lose when Europe is not anymore what it once was. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ms. Insir. 1 minute, please.
Kollegor, religiösa, speciellt judar och muslimer, känner oro.
Colleagues, the Jews and Muslim of Europe are worried. We have to fight against the need for this type of fear. We can't say that hatred against certain people is acceptable or that there are differences between people. Human beings are human beings, regardless of their ethnic background or their religion. To do otherwise would be dangerous. And this is the ideology of the far right. We've seen manifestations of this ideology in history in Europe. We've seen it in Sweden, and this has had serious consequences in my country. Acts have been carried out against Muslims, and here what we need to do is to ensure that we are paying attention to what happens with the Christians. Ulf Kristersson, the Prime Minister, and a whole series of statements have been made against Muslims, saying that there are differences, that Islamophobia and anti-Christian sentiment are not the same thing. We have to fight against hatred.
You have to stick to the speaking time afterwards, please.
Yes.
Mr. Sonska.
Polish, please take the chance. Dużo pani mówiła o...
Madam, you've spoke a lot about Jews and Muslims being discriminated against, and that's true, that happens.
Dużo pani mówiła...
You've said a lot about persecution of Muslims and Jews, and that's true, but it's no secret that the largest, the most persecuted group are the Christians, and you've said nothing about them. So let me ask you a question. You're from the socialist group. In your group, the socialists during this term include individuals who attack the Catholic Church in Poland. There have been trials. The courts have set them free, but they've been vandalising buildings, graffitiing, they've been desecrating. So perhaps you could focus on the socialist group and talk to those colleagues to stop insulting the Catholic Church in Poland. Thank you.
Vårt hat och hot mot våra...
The threat is from hatred. We have to condemn hatred everywhere, regardless of where it comes from. I've said that in my speech. I said that any types of hatred are unacceptable. I condemn all types of hate, including that against Christians. But will you condemn hate against Jews and Muslims?
I would like to remind you about the rules on the blue card. It is a question, 30 seconds, and an answer, 30 seconds. Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Ms. Sorel, 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Chers collègues,
Colleagues, what rise in religious toleration are we really talking about? The migration ministers in 1991 drew alarm to the fact that amongst many immigrant communities there's a correlation between the community and religion, and there would be problems when the religious practices of the immigrants ran counter to the traditions of the host society. The real question then is the hierarchy of rights. In the name of religious freedom, are we prepared to sacrifice individual freedom or the equality of the sexes or the dignity of the woman? Abdul Wahab, an ideologue of Tunisia, ran counter to that when proclaiming women should wear the veil. In the 17th century, religious wars tore Europe apart, and John Locke, the philosopher, warned against using religious symbols that give men the opportunity to set themselves apart, and he warned against sedition that could undermine civil society. How can the European Commission not see Europe today sinking increasingly day by day into a new war of religions? Are we faced with a rise in religious intolerance or a determined resistance to imported obscurantism or unbridled fanaticism? The European people stand by our fundamental principles. Colleagues, let's not remain mute when it's the continuity of the history of the European peoples at stake today before our very eyes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, please stick to your speaking time. That means that more colleagues will have a chance to speak here today. The next speaker is Mr. Brudzinski for 1 minute, please.
Dziękuję.
Thank you, members, Commissioner. We've heard a lot about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and quite rightly. But we live in Christian Europe, and the situation today is such that 44%, there's been a 44% rise in violence against Christians. Last year in France, there were attacks against Christian places of worship, and there were 1,000 such attacks. So we talk about persecuted Christians, but in the last Parliament, when we finally got around to doing that, it was at 11 o'clock at night. We were talking about the Boko Haram kidnapping and murders, and my speech was interrupted. It was called a hate speech. Today, your friends are in government in Poland, and Polish priests are in prison have been in months. One is his life is at risk. There are persecution against priests who are running Catholic missions. So it's hate against Catholics that we're seeing in Poland. Europe is either going to be Christian or it won't be Europe at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I use the hammer, it means that you have already gone over your speaking time, so it means that you should end the speech. Next speaker is Mr. Clausen for 1 minute and 30 seconds. Velkommen.
Når jeg hører om religiøs intolerance,
when I hear about religious intolerance, it makes me feel ill. For how long has intolerance harmed individuals and a group? And groups fight for the right to be intolerant. Intolerant towards those who have a different sexuality, a different skin color, a different religion, or something else. I have nightmares when I hear the dark forces of the right increasingly using religion as an excuse for their intolerance and as a tool to spread it. And we should not think that we are immune to religious intolerance. You just have to look at what's happening in the United States to see how things can evolve. People are using religious pretexts to attack the right to abortion. This means women are dying or ending up with disabilities because they can't get a legal abortion. They want to use religion to limit people's rights to choose their sexual partners. Or in Europe, if you look at Georgia with the latest legislation, which is following in the footsteps of Putin, or Orban, who's increasingly using intolerance as a tool to serve his own power. For me, there's only one way forward. We have to fight religious intolerance wherever it's found, whatever its justification is. The only thing we cannot tolerate is intolerance.
For 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. In Europe, anti-Christian hate crime is rising alarmingly. Who are the perpetrators? Well, the OSCE reports that the majority of these cases are committed by the extreme left-wing political groups like anti-fascists, radical feminists and LGBTIQ groups. And that is shameful and emblematic of the loss of democracy in Europe and the increasing intolerance that is spreading among the left of the political spectrum. One example shows what it's about. Ben Dubovsky said in a mandatory diversity training course that he believed in traditional marriage, that life begins at conception, and that he opposed the stoning of homosexual men under Sharia law. The next day, he was dismissed for hate speech. We in the AFD and the ESN call on the Commission to reinstate in full the right to the free expression of basic Christian positions. Germany needs the AFD and Europe needs the ESN.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Lazarus for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. I see that we speak very often, colleagues, about religious intolerance, but what about attacks of the state on religion? I come from a country with a Orthodox majority, Romania, and I have powerfully observed as many as the Orthodox religion was suffering under the pandemic, and we've also seen all sorts of problems facing the church, and I've seen different NGOs celebrating all sorts of events and blaspheming against the Orthodox religion. I've seen certainly what also has happened at the Paris Olympics. I am very proud to be an Orthodox. I'm very proud to be a Romanian, and now I will attend a important religious ceremony or parade in Iași with almost 2 million people. Churches nowadays have been turned into museums and concert halls, and this is an exception. Thank you.
Colleagues, I know that 1 minute is not a very long time, but please try to stick to it. That would be appreciated. Next speaker is Ms. Pereira for 1 minute and 30 seconds, please.
O ódio, a intolerância e o fanatismo não devem ter...
Hate, intolerance, fanatism have no place in the EU. Copenhagen, Madrid, Nice, Brussels, cities which have seen the results of this fanaticism over the last couple of decades. We are victims of those who would use faith to justify death, violence and destruction. These are people who don't like Europe for what it represents: equality, freedom and hope. We must fight against hate speak in Europe. Online, offline, we have to protect all of our citizens regardless of where they are, regardless of their religion. We have to protect places of worship, be it synagogues, churches or mosques. These are places of tolerance and peace.
Christians in Nigeria and raised awareness about the rising of anti-Semitism in the world. That is why in this Parliament we do not shy away, we do not hesitate in denouncing what is happening with the Uyghurs in China. And that is why we condemned the hideous attack of Hamas 1 year ago with the same conviction that we call on a ceasefire that saves innocent lives in the region. And to conclude, Madam President, políticos, famílias, escolas e organizações, cada de nós, todos...
Schools, parents, at every level we have to fight against hatred. It's not by law, you have to do it on a day-to-day basis as well.
You have to conclude before the end of your speech, and when you see the red light, you should at least do it there and not continue for half a minute. The next speaker is Mr. Lopez Aguilar for 1 minute, please.
Gracias, Presidenta, Vicepresidente.
Thank you, President. Commissioner Skinas, it's 2024, and it's rather worrying that we're talking about the rise of religious intolerance and hatred in the EU. The diagnosis has been done. We have the proof on the table about the rights, fundamental rights. We've heard a chorus of different voices here. The decision in 2008, the Marco ruling against religious intolerance, sets away. There's no scope for religious intolerance in Europe. The Commission has said that, and the Parliament has tabled under Article 83 of the treaty action against religious intolerance or intolerance of people who come from different ethnic or religious or other communities, and the need for action there in all member states. This is a problem because we have a proliferation of hate crime online, and we see places of worship under threat in Europe, and whatever governments of member states or regional local authorities are involved, this is an issue for them. It's not just about protecting the victim, of course that must happen, it's also about protecting the speaker is interrupted.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ms. Witczek for 1 minute, please.
Thank you. Dear President, Commissioner, honourable members, European Christianity is under attack due to illegal migration. Recently, the number of anti-Christian hate crimes have increased, due to which Christians in the whole EU are getting marginalized and squeezed out of public life. Christian places of worship are attacked, and these attacks are not mere vandalism. These are hate crimes, which are against the whole Christianity, as infringe upon the fundamental right for freedom of confession. Every religious community should be given protection. Therefore, it would be important that the Commission should nominate a coordinator for a position for a coordinator to protect Christianity, to curb attacks against Christianity, and protect values. Christianity traditionally is part of the European identity, and we European citizens should be able to protect it.
Thank you very much, also for sticking to your speaking time. Mr. Intelvini, for 1 minute, please.
Europa, ritrova te stesso.
Europe, you have to get back to your origins, back to your roots. We need to bring back the authentic values that made our history so glorious. That's what Pope John Paul II said. When it comes to religious tolerance, Europe is Christian. That's our identity, and that is what our people have chosen for millennia. Today, if you're Christian, often this means you're laughed at. And in 2022, 708 hate crimes were recorded against Christians. The latest affront has been the mocking of the Last Supper at the Paris Olympics. And faced with all of this, we have to remember who we are. We should be proud of who we are and defend our roots. We should be shouting, Europe, stand up and defend who you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Neuhoff for 1 minute, please.
Herr Kommissar China.
Commissioner Chinas, you might not want to hear it, but mass immigration of Muslims into Christian and secular Europe is to an import of religious intolerance. You don't need to read the papers and look at Islamic crimes to see that. It's an everyday thing now. A 13-year-old in school in Bonn has been running a group of radical Islamic school pupils and forcing other pupils to radical Islamic behavior. Ramadan, people were accused of breaking Ramadan whilst they had their snacks. People have been sent into early retirement because they came in and interrupted choir practice, saying that music was haram. And the left is daring in this house to stop us criticizing Islam and say it's Islamophobia and calling us mad. Mr. Chinas, your hubris, endless hubris, looking for completion of Europe, but you are digging Europe's grave, Mr. Chinas.
Next speaker. Oh, there is a blue card. Mr. Neuhoff, there is a blue card. Do you want to take that? Oh, okay. Then we continue. Next speaker is Mr. Brown for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much. Laudetur Jesus Christus.
Praise be to God. Jesus be praised in this chamber as well. This chamber, which is almost a shrine to Babel. And this was a challenge, of course, sent to us by God. But this chamber would not exist were it not for godly greetings. There would be no concept of equality before the law, because that has been promoted by the Catholic tradition. Lies, threats, Talmud, the Quran are concealed here. We're accused of anti-Semitism, of Islamophobia. You don't want the Gospels to be the centre of our society. You don't want it to be protected. You will fall to your knees and prostrate yourselves in the face of hordes of invaders.
Can I ikke høre det mere. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Sofko for 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam President. Europe has long prided itself on being a beacon of tolerance and diversity, at least the side that was not under communism, where priests and cardinals and other religious leaders were persecuted and long put in jail and persecuted for their religion and belief. My great-uncle, a bishop of Mostar, was for 10 years in prison because he didn't want to separate for Holy See from Vatican. Christians historically shaped much of Europe's cultural heritage, and they are facing increasing hostility. In 2023, a total of 800 anti-Christian crimes was recorded in Europe. At the same time, anti-Semitism is emerging, its ugly head once more stronger than ever since the terrorist attack in October 7th. Jewish communities who have already endured centuries of persecution are target of violence and discrimination, with hateful rhetoric being on the rise online and public spaces. Europe is not just in a crisis of religious freedom, but under direct threat to the core values of our European identity: respect, tolerance, and human dignity. We must stand united against all forms of hatred, whether they are targeting Christians, Jews, Muslims, or any other religious group. By fostering dialogue, educating against prejudice, and strengthening legal protections, we can combat this dangerous trend and ensure that Europe remains a place where all faiths can coexist in peace. I'm honored that the EPP has given me the honor, together with Mr. Mamarakis, to the only working group in European Parliament dedicated to this issue. The EPP Working Group on Intercultural and Interreligious Dialogue will continue its fight for it. And thank you, Mr. Skinas, for helping us in the past to spread this message throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, we have a slight problem with the machine and who should speak when, but the next speaker is Mr. Aziz for 1 minute, so please.
Thank you, Mr. A liberdade religiosa é uma das bases, é dos princípios.
Religious freedom is an essential part of European modernity. And there are a number of things that are essential here. First of all, freedom of belief. Then the separation between state and religious organizations. Now, that doesn't mean that religion doesn't have a place in political life, but there has to be a distinction between state and religious institutions. Next, equality before the law, regardless of your religion. We've got to where we are because we have had cultural struggles over many centuries, and it's led us to the Europe that we know. Now, I've heard some of the extreme right members this morning talk about Christian Europe, about Europe that only makes sense if it refers back to its Christian roots. You're a bit like the Ayatollahs in the way you say that. Religion is not the basis on which Europe is built, and we should avoid fanaticism.
And the announcement of who will speak. The next speaker is Mr. Boscher for 1 minute, please. And I do apologize for this. We are trying to do what we can to fix it.
Grazie. Intanto mettiamo.
Thank you. Well, we need to make sure we are exact here. Before we talk about Islamophobia, although we may want to deny it, the roots of Europe are Christian, not Muslim. But perhaps we should look at the 2024 report from the European Agency of Fundamental Rights. This study confirms a lot of the problems that the Lega has been sounding the alarm about in recent years, problems related to welcoming people in at any cost. This agency speaks out about the increase in Islamic communities and problems with the Jewish community. For example, we want to tackle religious intolerance. Fine, but how many Muslim women live in Europe in oppression? If we're going to condemn these situations, then we need to remember who's being silent about it. If you're silent, then you consent.
With the machine, the next speaker is Mr. Rysen. 1 minute, please. I'm so sorry. I know that it's difficult for you to be ready when you're not announced on the screen. They are trying to fix the problem as soon as possible, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. Beste collega's, geachte commissaris.
Thank you very much, President. Dear colleagues, Commissioner, for centuries, Europe has been moulded by Christianity. The former Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl said, Europe stops where its church spires stop. Meanwhile, many churches stand empty. They're converted into fitness centres or even worse, ripped down. That is very sad, not least because a lot of cultural heritage is thereby lost, but also because, as a result, the voice of the church on very important matters is no longer heard when we're talking about justice or neighbourly love or sin or finding grace in the cross of Christ. That's why I would like to appeal not just for tolerance towards the church, but also that the church should be given back the value it deserves. When we're talking about empty churches, there's a very simple solution. Everyone should go back to church more often. I can only warmly commend that to you.
Just a brief interruption for a couple of announcements. I have received a request from the competent authorities in Hungary for the parliamentary immunity of Peter Magyar to be waived, and this request is referred to the Committee on Legal Affairs. The PFE group has notified me of decisions relating to changes to appointments within committees and delegations. These decisions will be set out in the minutes of today's sitting and take effect on the date of this announcement. And I have received from the Council its position at first reading, as well as the reasons which led to its adoption and the positions and opinions of the Commission. The full title will be listed in the minutes of this sitting. The 3-month period available to Parliament to pronounce itself begins to run tomorrow from 11th of October. Thank you.
So, now we're back, and I think that the screen works as well. And finally, it's your turn, Mr. Sidekovsky. You have the floor for 1 minute and 30 seconds, and I do apologize for the fact that you had to spring back and forth.
Vážený pane komisaři,
Commissioner Skinas, ladies and gentlemen, it is unbelievable that in the 20th century people are afraid to wear a cross in public or afraid to send their kids to school. This week I had the opportunity to talk to the local Jewish community here. They told me about repeated attacks on their kids, on adults. They are scared. They are scared to live in the EU, in the Europe of the 21st century. This is wrong. Churches burned down, attacks on synagogues, attacks on representatives of churches within the EU. It's a problem that we have to solve. It is unimaginable that in the 20th century the EU is presenting itself as a protector of democracy and freedom. We face such hatred. Personally, I think the freedom of religion is a fundamental human right. Every citizen, regardless of their faith, should have the right to practice their religion if it is in line with the legislation, with the applicable legislation, without having to fear of violence or discrimination. We have to condemn all forms of religious hatred, whether they are directed against Christians, Jews, or any other group. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mr. Kubin for 1 minute, please.
Vážené kolegyně, vážení kolegové.
Dear colleagues, after the Second World War, Europe tried to become wiser, and with a few exceptions it did. However, in recent years, the religious intolerance in Europe has been gaining its momentum. This is usually manifested as hatred against religious minorities. However, in Europe, we see a different story. Out of 73% of religious citizens, over 90% profess to be Christian. Yet it is the Christianity that is the target of the vast majority of verbal and physical attacks. The second in line come attacks on Jews and Jewish properties. However, the classification as an act of religious intolerance does not entirely hold up, because the target of these attacks is not Judaism but the Jews. So it's more to be seen as racism, but let us count them in as well. So please, let's leave aside the self-censorship so common among some politicians and some journalists, and let us admit and say without euphemisms that the increase in religious intolerance in Europe is mainly caused by the influx of people who bring hateful ideology to Europe, of which religious and racial intolerance is an integral part. Thank you.
Giavi for 1 minute, please.
Η αύξηση των λαθρομεταναστών στην Ευρώπη ατόμων.
In Europe, we have more and more illegal immigrants, people who often want to impose Sharia law, and that's led to an increase in religious intolerance. It's also meant that in the name of Islam, we've had attacks in European cities. We know who are responsible, those who say that you're backward if you talk about religion, those who are condemning us as racists if we want to stop illegal immigrants. But if you talk about open borders, then you're called modern. You want to abolish religion, you're called progressive. These are the people who, when they talk about radical Islam, have tears in their eyes and they condemn you. But recently, during the Olympic Games in Paris, Christianity was ridiculed, and they say nothing about that. There's two other things I want to mention. First of all, the systematic desecration of churches in occupied Cyprus and their conversion into stables and mosques. And the same goes for the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. This is an attack on holy places in Christianity.
Akis for 1 minute and 30 seconds, please.
Αγαπητοί συνάδελφοι, άκουσα με πολύ προσοχή.
Colleagues, I've listened carefully to what Mr. Skinner said, and I fully endorse what he said. We, the EPP, are the only party who have a specific committee looking at this, as Madam Zofko has said. We, together with other colleagues, make concrete proposals on this issue. At these times of instability, war, crisis, we need to defend our own principles. Our societies are multicultural and so religious. We have to ensure peace in our society, and we can only do that through mutual respect for all religions. Interconfessional dialogue has an important role here. And the policies that we pursue in the coming 5 years have to ensure harmony between religions and therefore people. And so against this backdrop, today's debate is to fight the instrumentalization of religions and using them for intolerance. Any intolerance based on religions will damage social cohesion in many of our countries. So we have to tackle this country with awareness and respect for diversity, but also with a humanitarian view as well, to ensure cooperation and peaceful coexistence between peoples. We have nothing to lose by pursuing this dialogue. Religious respect is a fundamental tenet of interreligious dialogue, a respect for humanity and the principle of our innate religious spirit.
Oh, there.
Madame la Présidente, mes chers collègues.
Madam President, colleagues, for a number of years we've seen what you rather modestly call religious intolerance to Christians in the East, and people are living in exclusion, precarity, insecurity, and my colleague has decided to create an intergroup on the Christians of the East, and I hope many of us will attend. But in terms of this freedom, we see here religious intolerance nevertheless on the rise, and we see a number of believers and places of worship targeted for what they are. And I think we need to probe the causes of that and to extend a listening ear. It's your mass uncontrolled immigration policies that are changing the face of Europe and creating a culture and civilizational shock and bringing hate, whether it's Christian, homophobic or sexual. It's undermining our values and our roots, and we are remaining passive as we see that. Our civilization, we watch as it is crumbling away, trampled down, and we see the whole swathes of towns suffering now, and we must expel from our soil those who don't respect our laws and cultures.
Mr. Kartheiser for 1 minute, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner, we should lament religious intolerance. In Europe, Christians are persecuted, Christian churches are set alight and desecrated. In Ukraine, the Orthodox Church, affiliated to the Moscow Patriarch, has just been banned. Because of massive illegal immigration, anti-Semitism is once again a danger for the Jewish community in Europe. Some on the left hide their anti-Semitism, arguing that they are anti-Zionist. But all anti-Semitism is unacceptable. It's Judeo-Christian values that shaped Europe and laid the foundations for our freedom. Religious tolerance is a fundamental value of the European Union. Those who would oppose that, those who deny our history, those who attack believers, and those who don't favour the freedom of confession, and those who would impose a different culture on Christian Europe will have to face up to our determination to defend our freedom and our values.
Mr. Kartheiser, there is a blue card. There's a blue card. Mr. Kartheiser? Do you want to take a blue card? Please. And it is Vice President Stefanuccia, please.
Je voulais juste demander si dans ses...
I just wanted to ask whether in his eyes there is a linkage between what he's saying about the Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine and the freedom of religion, or maybe there are some doubts about how that institution is functioning to the benefit of the Russian state during a time of war.
My apologies, I'm not familiar with your name. Please don't take offence at that. Even in war, freedom of religion should be guaranteed. It gives people hope. It gives a moral aspect to things that should be respected during war, perhaps more during war than in other times. In Ukraine, there is, of course, a lot of concern about human rights, and we don't talk enough about it here. Ukraine is not a rule of law as we'd like to see it become. We say it's there to defend values that we, the EU, would like to defend, but unfortunately it's not always the case with Ukraine. This ban of a church was criticised by many defenders of human rights, including in the US, and I refer you to those discussions. Thank you.
The next speaker is Ms. Benjumea for 1 minute, please.
Gracias, Presidenta. Thank you, President. Vice President. Faced with the extremely alarming rise in anti-Semitism in Europe, I want to raise my voice and speak out about the increase in hate crimes against Christians in Europe. 708 crimes are recorded against Christians in Europe. Now, we hear about over 300 million Christians persecuted around the world, but I just want to make it clear that this phenomenon is not alien to Europe's borders. And when Christianity is attacked, it's not just an attack upon religious individual freedom of citizens, but it's also an attack on Western culture. When this religion is attacked, the attacks are upon the religion that inspired equality between humans. The influence of Christian humanist, Judeo-Christian principles in Europe has always been one of the most perverse strategies of the radical left. And we have to continue to sound the alarm about this and to defend our European way of life.
The next speaker is Mr. Vistisen for 2 minutes, please.
1 ud af 3 muslimer I Danmark svarer.
1 in 3 Muslims in Denmark say that the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October were at least partly justified. That's the biggest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Families, children, women were killed. People who were at a dance festival, innocents, were killed, shot down. And it goes further still. 1 in 2 Muslims say that the State of Israel doesn't have any right to exist. Now, these surveys are not just to be found in Denmark. We can see it in France and the UK. Wherever you have a Muslim community, you'll see the same sort of extremism and support to movements like Hezbollah, Hamas, or to Iran. We should say clearly that when Islam spreads, religious tolerance retreats. In the Middle East, we've gone from flourishing minority to countries where it's very difficult to be a Christian or a Jew. So let's be very clear. If you talk about religious tolerance, then you have to talk about, or really if you talk about religious intolerance, you have to talk about mass immigration into Europe. Someone can come to our continent, but they can't come and cause trouble with their religion in Europe. No one has the right to come to Europe and destroy the tolerance that we have created here for people who have different religions, who think differently, who are in sexual minorities. We have to hold fast. These are the foundations of Christian Europe that are disappearing.
And the next speaker is Mr. Sturza for 1 minute, please.
Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Madam President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves at a crossroads today where our sense of identity as Europeans is in the front line. Freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, all are the basic values of the European Union. Unfortunately, however, these freedoms are ones that are based in our Christian tradition and are under threat from secularization forced through by the dictatorship from top to bottom. Christendom in Europe is the founding stone of our civilization. We cannot allow the forces of secularization or globalization to undermine these vital principles that have defined the European peoples. I wish for a Europe that remains anchored in its Christian beliefs. a union of sovereign nations with each contributing to the magnificent, wealthy, spiritual and historical mosaic of Europe. Our Christianity should not be lost. We should not lose our freedoms and traditions that well up from it.
Mr. Mandel, for 1 minute, please.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, wir diskutieren.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about the rise of religious intolerance in Europe, and we must stress that freedom is the freedom of others, as Rosa Luxemburg said, and that is key in European Union today. We have to defend the tolerance to others. The other thing that we have to keep an eye on is that people around the world consider religion more important than most people do in Europe at the moment. As such, it's even more important that we are open to other cultures and that we show respect to them. We know that Europe's identity is based on its Judeo-Christian roots, and that the Enlightenment led to the freedoms that we have based on those values. So we can help tolerance if we live it ourselves. I was talking to a young Jewish student recently, and they said that they recommend Muslims take the same study course, even if they're not allowed to at the moment. So that's a great signal of where we're going.
Speaker is Mr. Czarsinski for 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam President, we have this discussion on intolerance in Europe. Let's talk about intolerance in this chamber. Intolerance and hypocrisy. 2022, we submit the motion for debate on hate against Christians when Deborah Yubuku was killed, rejected. 2023, when we asked for a debate after Commission statement on hate, Muslims and Jews were mentioned, but not Christian. Rejected. So let's talk about hypocrisy and intolerance in here. In the same time, when I've been warning again about Muslim and Islamist floods coming with illegal migrants, I've been called Islamophobe. I don't have a phobia. I'm not afraid of them. Europe is a Christian continent by its faith and by its culture. That is why I'm going to fight for the Christian Europe until the final victory. So help me God. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ms. Pedro for 1 minute, please.
Senhor Presidente, Senhor Comissário, vivemos tempos de grande progresso.
President, Commissioner, we live in times when, unfortunately, we're seeing backsliding on progress. People are attacked just because of their faith, and this is not a few isolated incidents. Whenever there's an attack upon a church, a mosque or a synagogue, whenever we see attacks upon religions, then we are complicit. If we close our eyes to this rise in anti-Semitism, it's an error. We have to understand what's happening, and to do that, we have to look towards our dark history. We can't accept attacks upon churches. This cannot become normalized. It's a question of human dignity. If we aren't able to protect freedom of religion, then we're going to lose everything. We'll lose all of our other freedoms. We have to work on a daily basis to protect this Europe that we welcome with its differences and divergences. We have to protect the Europe that we know. Europe is not a Europe of hatred and intolerance.
I have come to the catch the eye, and colleagues, if you're kind and stick to your speaking time, I have a chance to give the floor to all 8 who has asked for the floor. You speak from your seat, and I will close the microphone around after 1 minute. First speaker is Mr. Stier for 1 minute, please.
Hvala predsjednice. Mislim da je kolega... Thank you, Chair.
I think our colleague Isabel Benjumea explained very well that attack against Christianity is attack against tolerance, against a religion that teaches us to love not only our enemy, not only our friends, but our enemies as well, and that we have to respect dignity of every human being. And this, for this reason, I would like to congratulate the Commissioner for everything that he did. He was in charge for fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim feelings, but it is clear that attacks against Christians have increased as well, and I think that the new Commission has to have a coordinator for the fight or the hatred against Christians. We shouldn't promote such intolerance. We who are parties of the centers, who are parties of the, have to deal with this topic.
Mr. Andriukaitis for 1 minute, S&D.
Dėkoju, gerbiamą posėdžio pirmininkę.
Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chairman, dear colleague Margaritis, we have heard an excellent presentation and very useful proposals. I would like to remind that this plenary must respect the Lisbon Treaty, which stresses that the European Union is based on all values, humanism, democracy, and the cultural values of all religious beliefs, including paganism. The European Union is based on all cultural traditions. All member states are sovereign, and therefore intercultural dialogue and respect for various cultural communities is the only way in strengthening and fostering our way of life. Thank you, Commissioner. We must strengthen our fight against intolerance.
The next speaker is Ms. de la Pisa-Carrion, 517.
Señorías, yo entiendo.
I believe abortion damages women and women should be offered alternatives. And it's said that being pro-life is intolerable. My way of thinking is not permitted in this chamber. Furthermore, all those who think like me are called people who are against human rights, and I'm accused of being an extremist for the way I think. But what is being suggested here, that I should no longer exist so as not to bother you? Freedom of conscience and religion are under threat in Europe because we don't sign up to this monolithic way of thinking. Thank you.
Is Mr. Molalsik, 590. Please. The microphone, you had to turn on the microphone.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, members of the House. Thank you for this important debate about growing intolerance in Europe. I would like to highlight intolerance to Christians. I'm particularly shocked by the arrest of priest Michał Olszewski in Poland. The current Liberal government has taken over the public prosecutor and arrested illegally Michał Olszewski, who built a centre supporting victims of violence. The prosecutor didn't have the right to do that. He's been arrested, he's been in jail for 8 months now. New charges are trumped up against him. His dignity has been violated. His dignity as a priest has been violated. He's been tortured in custody. He has been held in handcuffs. Food has been withdrawn from him. Please think of Michał Olszewski, who is illegally held in Poland, and that for 8 months now. Thank you.
Ms. Sabai, 642, please.
Ici. À 20 ans, si j'ai rejoint le parti...
I endorse the Greens for their fight against equal rights and fighting out on all types of discrimination. And that's because I grew up listening to the far-right rhetoric, like we hear here in this chamber, hearing that we immigrants are the problem in Europe and in France. Without mentioning their contribution to the liberation and reconstruction of Europe. Today, this type of discourse reduces citizens to their ethnic background, to their religious identity. It makes our citizens weaker, so much that researchers have shown that young people are leaving Europe because of this atmosphere. So if we want to fight intolerance in Europe, if we want to see a united Europe, we have to put a stop to this type of discourse.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Subnivsky, seat 529.
Szczęść Boże.
Go with God. Now, for the love of God, please hang a cross in this miserable room as we discuss intolerance. Hardly anyone's bothered with it in the Polish parliament. Why are you pushing back against our European heritage? Even the Union flag was inspired by the face of Mary, something you seem to have forgotten. Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world. And that goes for Europe too. In this House, we condemn violations of human rights and the rights of minorities all around the world. But we forget about the majority living here in Europe that is persecuted. Christians are the silent victims. There's no silence or resolution for them. The Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe has documented in its latest report an increase in hate crimes against Christians, desecration of Christian places of worship and cemeteries. And the big problem is converts from Islam to Christianity, something the media fails to report on. Intolerance has a hidden face. Freedom of speech is being restricted, conscience clauses for doctors are being banned, crosses are being banned, and the left are particularly active in this regard.
Next speaker is Mr. Perez, 855, please.
Muchísimas gracias. ¿Se me escucha? Sí.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'm Salvise, and I would like to ask permission to create a new religion named after me, allowing the assassination of 5,000 Christians every year, and Olympics in which there is blasphemy against Christianity, as in France, and where 27 churches are desecrated, as happened in France last year, or other such things, where I will be allowed to treat gays as if they're ill, or women as if they're animals with less rights than a dog, or other such things. And I'd be told I was mad and I had no tolerance for people doing that. But why do we have to have tolerance to people who attack the freedoms of thought and the fundamental rights of the EU? Religious freedom and the freedom of thought and freedom of religious expression.
The final speaker in the Catch the Eye is Ms. Lexman for 1 minute, please.
Vážení kolegovia, colleagues, Commissioner Skinas, we are all concerned watching the growing religious intolerance across Europe. According to the OSCE, in 2022, more than 792 hate crimes were committed against Christians. In 2023, we witnessed an alarming increase, with more than 1,000 incidents in France alone. Within the last month, we've seen another 9 arson attacks on churches in Europe. We observe with concern the increasing intolerance in universities, workplaces, or even in the media. Much of today's public discourse is focusing on equality. However, it seems that when it comes to those who don't want to hide their religion, these rules really don't apply. Christianity and Judeo-Christian values are the backbone of our Western civilization. Christians were at the center of our own struggle for freedom and for peace. today, therefore, we need to go back to these values more than anything else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for helping me out with the speaking time. You were more precise. Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to the Vice President of the Commission, Mr. Schinas, to wrap up the discussion. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, dear colleagues, to all of you for this rich and at times difficult debate. These are sensitive, important topics that touch the core of what Europe represents today as a union of freedom, as a union of democracy, as a model of society that we need to preserve both within and beyond our borders. I think we all agree that religious intolerance should be addressed in all its dimensions. First, internally. It is essential that we will step up our joint action on this issue. All of us work together at EU level, within the EU institutions, without pointing fingers, without cries of hatred, without toxicity, through dialogue and understanding, with the Commission ready to play a role in funding, in supporting, in catalyzing, in accelerating processes and networks that bring togetherness amongst Europeans, but also beyond our borders, where we do have an opportunity to defend the freedom of religion and belief everywhere. Everywhere where Christianity is under threat, but also everywhere where other religions fall victim of persecution. We have a moral duty to stand for religious freedom. And I'm very happy to inform this new House, that has been elected in July, that together with President von der Leyen, we have appointed an EU envoy for promoting and protecting religious freedom across the world, a well-known, experienced political personality, Frans van Dalen, who would be delighted to come and share with this House his experiences. He already accompanied me on specific missions to Jerusalem, and he has recently visited Pakistan to take this European message further. I also listened very carefully to mentions on churches, Christianity. And as a Christian, I also share this concern. But in my view of Christianity, Christianity is about love, is about tolerance. It's about loving, not hating others. And there is a strong message, image, that I will never forget. In this house, in this very house, on Friday, the 1st of July, where a great European, a Catholic, Helmut Kohl, wanted to have his funeral procession here in this house. He chose the House of European Democracy as place for his funeral to show that Europe is, above all, something that belongs to all of us. And then, of course, he was buried in a magnificent ceremony, in a mass in the Speyer Cathedral. So, dear colleagues, 5 years ago, in my parliamentary hearing, when I was appointed Vice President for promoting the European way of life, by the way, I have the honor to have the record of the longest Commission-designate hearing in the history of the European Commission. My hearing lasted for 3 hours and 20 minutes. At the heart of this hearing was the notion of the European way of life. Some parts of this House wanted to interpret the European way of life as a binary choice, as an us against the rest choice as the European equivalent of make America great again, as a bulldozer that would crush anyone who's not like us. I said then, and I said it now at the end of this political cycle, that the European way of life, it's not a bulldozer. It's a mirror that reflects the richness, the diversity, the might, the values, the principles that unite us. The fact that we're a union of democracies, where minorities' rights are protected by constitutional guarantees, where the role of women is safeguarded in the family, in the society, in the workplace, where we have universal and free systems for education and health, where we take care of our elderly, where we're the world champions of human rights, of data protection, and where we don't have the death penalty. You can find bits and pieces of this elsewhere in the world, but all this together you will only find here, and it's called the European way of life. Thank you.
Ďakujem, pán komisár.
Thank you, Commissioner. The debate is now closed on this topic. The following point is communication by the Commission, World Mental Health Day, the importance of protecting mental health. I'm very glad that we are having this debate today when we celebrate the World Mental Health Day. So over to you, Mr. Commissioner. Again, take the floor on behalf of the Commission.
Thank you, President, honorable members. On another subject, I cannot find a better occasion to mark the World Mental Health Day than this debate today. This is